And we are talking only about public corruption. Of course, there's another dimension linked to private corruption, but we are not going to talk about that because public corruption is one of the most important issues on this debate. But what Quiroz says is that corruption is the unlawful use of power by bureaucrats or political actors that are engaged with private sector people in order to obtain economical profit, and from this personal gain, that means to obtain them are appropriation of public funds and distortion of institutions and policies. And this is important because corruption is not only an economical phenomenon. When we will talk later about impact, we will see that the problems generated by corruption are not only on the economical side, but there are much more and gross problems that appear from corrupt practices, and these have to do with institutions. And when we affect institutions by corrupt practices, then we are engaging governments, and then we have governance problems, and then we have wars, and we have killings, and we have any sort of different bad results that derive from these practices. But I would say that when we talk about public corruption, we have always a double entry. The entry from the public sector and this case of corrupt public officers, and then actors from the private sector making this illegal business with these public officials. Now, there are differences in the intensity of the phenomenon, and I would say that the maximum situation that we can view on public corruption is when we have the capture of the state, and that's one of the cases I would like to talk further a little bit more when I address the Peruvian case.
Okay, very good. Obi, does that definition work for you?
I think that there are a couple of interesting concepts that he already touched on. I look at corruption as being a symptom of a deeper problem. And the deeper problem is that corruption is symptomatic of environments where institutions don't function well and accountability is in deficit. And therefore, corruption happens as a result of that. What it therefore means is that to be able to deal with corruption, you have to get much more fundamental in your diagnostics of what the problems could be, as well as therefore deriving from those diagnostics the ways to prevent corruption. One important thing about the limitations of the definition that we had earlier is that first, it fails to recognize the fact that corruption involves two parties. There is the giver and there is the taker. There is the person who offers and the person who receives. And therefore, there is a demand and supply side to corruption. And therefore, we need to ask ourselves, would it only be in the public sector that you have both the giver and the taker? Of course not. So there is somebody outside of the public sector, most often in the private sector, who is either the giver or the taker, as the case may be. The roles change differently. And then another limitation is, of course, what I already alluded to, which is that fundamentally it is the fact that the environment lends itself to such an abuse, meaning that government is unable to allow the rules to be respected. So surely there must be a weakness that enables and permits people to be able to engage in that behavior. That then takes us to the questions as to what are the incentives and the disincentives that lead to such behavior, and why would it multiply when it is not rigorously dealt with. I'll leave it there for now.
Aruna, is there a such thing as good corruption?
Well, I am going to go back to my roots, rather where my preoccupation with corruption has begun.
Oh, slide, yes.
Slide 2. That's the one, second one. That's it. That's where the Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, the organization which I come from, which is not an NGO, which is a political social activism organization in the stream of Gandhiji and Jayaprakash Narayan, two people who didn't join political office, but who joined the political process. So in India, there is an overlay between political action, outside political structures, and within. And if we don't understand this, my campaign will not be rooted. So I wanted to say that this campaign does not receive funds from any institution, either Indian or abroad. We raise all our money from people. We live very simply, as you can see, in this little village hut. And the notions that I've put in front of you have come from debates not in Delhi, not in Bombay, not in Bangalore, but from people like this all over India who really suffer the worst of corruption. So I want to contextualize myself there. And I just want the next slide, please, to just show you the kinds of people who are the thinkers, the people who have conceptualized, who have debated, and have come to very profound political academic conclusions, and who have helped shape the law. Having said that, I'll tell you what I understand by corruption because it makes sense. That slide, please. For poor people and for the most marginalized and the people who receive the worst end of every contract, social contract with government, are the people on the margins. And for us, what does it mean? It's not merely financial corruption. It's not merely taking a bribe. That's bad and we oppose it. But it's also the arbitrary use of power. In India, power can be used because of tradition, when you belong to a particular caste. It can be because of political pressures, it can be nepotism, it can be a range of issues which may not strictly come under the definition of corruption as we normally understand it. So for us, it's also arbitrary use of power. It's also the use of power by the state to kill people who oppose its policies, to participate in discriminatory killings of people who belong to different religions or groups. It's a large number of issues for us. So corruption is, I agree with Obi's, is a symptom and not a disease. Now this slide, one previous please, that one kind of, the one after this please. that one kind of tells you what are the various issues we would think would fall under corruption. There is casteism, there's oppression, there's racism in India because we come from different ethnic groups, there's religious persecution, and there's undemocratic governance, there's patriarchy, there's tyranny, there's injustice, there's ostracism, and there's nepotism. And therefore, corruption is very often narrowly defined by where we are situated. So I would say it's a symptom and not the disease, and it should be looked at in that. And I agree with Obi on that.
Larry? Do you, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. Let me get that mic over to you. I got you.
I'll be brief and then we'll pass it right back. I think the definition is really important, and I think we're not going to be able to give it justice or due diligence today. I'm thrilled to be on a panel with so many people with so much experience, but from my perspective, Afghanistan, for example, doesn't have institutions. It doesn't have rule of law necessarily that's extant and capable of managing corruption. So I'm interested in perhaps a nuanced definition that doesn't think of corruption as symptoms of an illness, but that is an illness itself. I'm doing some work on the outbreaks in Haiti right now. And I'm struck by the similarities in terms of you can never manage a pathogen. You can't manage them. They won't go away. But you manage the vectors. And in this case, that's rule of law. That's transparency. That's exposure of corruption where it exists, because it can't exist in the light of close scrutiny from the people who are the victims.
Outbreaks you're referring to?
A particular pathogen, and I'm actually blanking on the name of the pathogen in Haiti right now, cholera. There is a huge problem in Haiti with cholera, which is waterborne. And we're treating it not by trying to eliminate the pathogen, because we can't. We're treating it by eliminating the vectors, which is tainted water, which is washing hands, which is washing dishes. If we try to eliminate it, to completely eradicate the pathogen, we're going to fail. But if we can find ways to manage and mitigate it so that the people most at risk of the pathogen, whether it's cholera or whether it's corruption, are protected, then we can have the most impact with the dollars that we have available. And that will leave us more political will to continue action in future days. I'll stop with that. Just to say the government perspective, the USAID perspective, I think will be an interesting, perhaps, alternative to some of the other perspectives that we hear, just because we are politically constrained in perhaps ways that some other organizations aren't.
Thanks. And again, I want to come back to Obi. I want to kind of investigate this thought of good corruption. I mean, is there a such thing as good corruption? Kind of.
I've been laughing since I had that. Because it's been the basis of a lot of academic debate with quite some interesting and gadfly kinds of professors telling you that there's something about good corruption that can be good because it could create the impetus for economic growth. I don't subscribe to that, frankly. I think that, to the extent that even the primary definition of corruption, something that's corrupt can't possibly have anything good to go with it. So clearly it means that we need to look at corruption from the perspective of what kind of impact does it have? Does it corrode economic growth? Does it corrode the possibilities of an equitable society? That was the point that Aruna seemed to be making by expanding the scope of the issues that she would like to scrutinize as regards corruption. And my sense is that when you look at the fact that the cost and the consequences of corruption to economic growth, which is necessary for reducing poverty, is very deep, is very profound. You cannot possibly say the argumentation for good corruption. And so for me, it's a no. Corruption has absolutely no good outcome as far as I am concerned. Some other people might have a different perspective. I respect it. But I have seen the effect of corruption. The effect of corruption in many of the countries that we have to deal with, poor policy choices that can happen simply because some vested interests particularly have captured the state. And in that state capture, they can determine what kinds of policies are made. And so
Nigeria, perhaps.
So for example, when you have a situation where a monopoly hold or monopoly market is being held onto because people have financed political parties and therefore obtain the benefits of that. That's corruption. And the impact is basically that you cannot have efficient services that the poor can pay for. Now, for as long as corruption has a significant impact, because corruption is a form of taxation, and it's a regressive taxation because it taxes those who don't have more than it taxes those that have. If you look at some of the things that we've seen in economic analysis, we find that small businesses pay a larger percentage of their profit or their business or their revenue to bribes and to activities that are associated with corruption than bigger businesses. So that clearly is an impediment to growth. And if you don't have growth, societies don't reduce poverty. Thank you.
Well, I would say that regarding the impact, corruption really kills. And there are different ways of having impact in a society. Kierkegaard created, a former professor of this university, created this formula saying that corruption equals to monopoly plus discretionary power from public officers, less accountability. And I'm sure that's one of the formulas that really explains how corruption works. But the issue is that when you have corrupt practices, you are not only having an economical phenomenon. And this debate of if there's a good or bad corruption is good because corruption makes some different dynamic in the economy is not taking into account that corruption has an impact on the lives of people, because corruption is usually also linked, big corruption, I mean, to democracy issues, governance issues, human rights abuses, and then you have thousands and millions of people are dying because of social unrest. You also have problems linked to corruption when people die because and infrastructure issues. A building that was not well done because someone took the money, and then the building falls down, and then you have hundreds of people dying there. In health, medicine that because of bribes should not be reaching human beings are now sold in many of the developing countries, and then you have thousands of people dying because of the vaccines or medicine that could not be used by humans. And so corruption is everywhere, and it has much more consequences than economical consequences. And I think if we see it from that point of view, and also the impact on institutions, corruption really affects the states and the governments, and when that happens, then we have a systemic problem. And when we have a systemic problem, then we can reach to these phenomena like state capture. I just wanted to, well, this is an interesting statement from Jim Wolfenson, the former president of the World Bank. He was the first to address the issue because before him it was forbidden to put in the World Bank reports the word corruption. They used to talk about the C word because they thought it was a political issue. And when Wolfenson in 1996 addressed the issue, he called it the cancer of corruption, and he said corruption undermines development, benefits the rich, and has very hard consequences on poor people. And this is what happened in Peru. That picture is a picture of Alberto Fujimori, who was the president of my country for 10 years. The guy by his side is Vladimiro Montesinos, the mastermind of this criminal network that took power. And I just will present these two slides. This is a diagram that represents how all the Peruvian state was under the control of a criminal network whose heads were Fujimori, Montesinos, and the general commander of the armed forces. And these three guys took control of the electoral system, the judiciary, the parliament, and even the private sector. And the whole Peruvian state and the whole Peruvian society was under control of this criminal organization. When we started the investigations, we found that there was no space in our reality that was not under control of this group. Even the Catholic Church had some affairs linked to Montesinos and Fujimori. And this is terrible from a country with such a Catholic tradition like Peru. And this slide, I think, reflects the impact of this capture from the criminal network of the Peruvian state. This is our hall of shame, like someone just told me here. This is some of the relevant detainees that we put in prison once we started the investigations. And you'll see there the Attorney General, of course the President, the former General Commander, Montesinos himself. They have been convicted to 25 years in prison now. And then ministries, congressmen, broadcasters, mayors. I mean, 1,500 people were indicted in this anti-corruption process. From them, more or less 10% finished in prison, and most of them have been convicted. So the impact of corruption should not only be measured in the economical side. Of course, in the economical side, I totally agree that it's very bad for the poor, and it's a benefit for rich people, but there are several other profound and very gross consequences that corruption generates and that affects the daily lives of people.
What were the broadcasters doing?
Well, in Peru we had 9 television channels. One was the official state channel, so it was under control of the government, but the other 9 sold, literally sold, by several millions of dollars, the editorial line of the channel. So every day you put any channel you would choose from the 8, the 8 will have propaganda in favor of the government. So they sold their line, their editorial line of their channels and some newspapers to the government.
And the Catholic Church? Can you talk briefly about that?
Well, the Catholic Church had some links with Montesinos. Our current Archbishop is from the Opus Dei, and he was in charge of the church at that time in a region where we had very active terrorism practices, and he was an advocate against human rights and supporting the government in order of some human rights abuses. We don't know what he obtained in exchange. We cannot prove he obtained money for that, but it was clear that he was very near to Fujimori in some issues.
Larry, this is for Larry and Obi. Obviously, the World Bank and USAID have large investment projects in developing or South countries, however you want to refer to them. Are these projects in any way driving corruption? Are they part of the problem?
Well, the predictable answer is of course not. They absolutely are. I mean, in listening to the presentations by the other panelists, I'm struck by, again, a question of definition. There's a range of contexts in which we consider corruption, from countries like the United States and the EU and countries that have a strong rule of law and a history and an expectation on the part of the population that corruption will be rooted out and punished. Running through, though, to places like Afghanistan, where there is no such rule of law and there is no such expectation. In fact, a counter anecdote, in Afghanistan, in an attempt to rid a particular ministry of a patriarchal organization where a deputy minister was appointing his family members, as I might add has been the history in Afghanistan for centuries, when his family members were removed from positions and replaced with other people representing other ethnicities and other clans and other interest groups, they charged in the courts in Afghanistan corruption. Because the patriarchy there was something that they expected. So I think the definition part of corruption and the impact that large organizations have on corruption is highly contextually specific. But I'm not waffling and dodging your question, although it's a very difficult one for USAID to answer. There's no question when you put $2 billion or $5 billion of development assistance into a country like Afghanistan, with the absorptive capacity or lack thereof that it has, I won't say that it fuels corruption. I will say that it increases the opportunity and it increases the benefit of those who choose to do things that are corrupt and or illegal. It makes it more profitable to be corrupt. And we work assiduously, as does the bank, to find ways to prevent that opportunity from being as lucrative as it is.
Obi?
Yeah, actually, you know, your anecdote about, you know, the C word and how long it took the World Bank to frontally take on corruption. And, you know, I was one of the co-founders of Transparency International as a global organization. And I always make a jest sometimes of my colleagues by saying that I recall when we founded Transparency International in 1993, and we wanted a meeting with the World Bank, and they said to us they didn't want to meet to talk about corruption. Because it is an issue that has to do with the sovereignty of each of the nations, and that it's very political in nature, and as a non-political institution, they needed to be mindful of it. But you know what? I think the best credit to the bank about taking on corruption would be the fact that I am sitting here as Vice President of the World Bank. So they didn't want to meet with us, right? You know, when we started Transparency International, but I happen to head one of the most important regions in the bank. That's one. The second thing is, by 2007, the bank actually worked on a governance anti-corruption strategy. A very important strategy that has enabled us to very robustly define the way that we can globally, as well as at a national level and also at project levels, make an impact on tackling corruption, but in a wider way, helping to institute good governance in as many countries as possible. And I think Larry was alluding to the fact that, you know, the definition might exclude countries where you have a complete state collapse, because that's really what, you know, so it's a spectrum. It's a spectrum of incidents of poor governance that you've got. So you've got the completely collapsed state, and you've got the fragile state, and then you've got the state that is, you know, kind of looks strong, but has weak institutions that haven't quite reached the level where they function well enough to enable accountability. So this spectrum is what we have, and that therefore means that you have to be country-specific in the approach that you're trying to tackle corruption. You cannot take a cookie-cutter approach and simply say there's some universal application of rules and procedures that would enable you to deal with it. So my sense is that what we do at the World Bank is to understand the political economy dynamics that we're dealing with in any situation. Our projects don't induce corruption. What our projects are really not meant to be World Bank projects. They are World Bank financed projects. And what we do is that we support the countries in implementing these projects. And part of what we've done as ways of ensuring a better tackling of the opportunities for corruption that exist in big infrastructure projects and, in fact, health and education projects. The incident of corruption in health and education, delivery of basic services, is huge, that we have to be careful not to sort of, you know, go away with some single solution approach and say it's about big infrastructure. What we try to do is to build in the systems that would enable the demand side and the supply side issues in tackling corruption. What do I mean by the demand side and the supply side issues? The supply side issues are the systems issues. Public financial management, how strong is it? The decentralization, fiscal decentralization, so that there's no centralization of control. What kind of internal control mechanisms do you have? What kind of project execution capacity exists? What kind of transparency models are built into the procurement systems? These are all important supply side issues. But then on the demand side, it's important that you should have the participation of the citizens. Otherwise, you don't have a full template of how to deal with governance and corruption. So on the demand side, the issues of transparency, even providing the information on projects, participating in the projects by the beneficiaries of the project. We have built in some of these mechanisms as ways of ensuring that we can understand the risks and mitigate the risks, because the risk of corruption is prevalent, and it has nothing to do with whether it's a developing country or a nearly developed country. Thank you.
Starting with Aruna, can we talk a bit about, we're talking about countries that have very dense populations, very large populations, and very large populations of poor people. Can you talk a bit about the effects of corruption on just the average, everyday person and everything going on? And then we go to the slides.
Actually, I think I'm not an academician and I haven't been to many of these seminars. So I can't really speak in bullets. So you'll forgive me if I speak a little more than I should. But I think in terms of what I have to say, the bullets will reduce what I have to say, just as the poor and poor countries have always been reduced to a figure. And that figure means nothing. So that's why when we say that corruption and the origins of corruption really are embedded in notions of inequality, injustice, and exploitation. If you don't say this, then corruption means nothing to me. You have to accept that corruption arises because of these fundamental lack of principles in developed, developing, affluent, poor, highly populated, and less populated countries. These are universally, for me, applicable to all countries. We have realized in India that political corruption and throwing away one government and bringing another doesn't solve it, because it's in the system. We've done it many times. We've thrown out despots, we've brought in other people, and still it's been the same. So the shift came when we understood that corruption is linked to processes of governance. And the second thing that has been part of our lives now very dramatically in the last 20 years is models of development. Development says that there's only one way. People say it's something else. You say we are a democracy. You tell us we have the right to decide. When we decide in small pockets that we don't want our forests removed, then growth tells us that's the only way to develop. And that if we don't dislocate ourselves and destroy our lives, there'll be no money. Money for whom? For corruption? Money for a few? Money for what? Have I been asked what I want to say? And if my country is a democracy, and I as a citizen have sovereign right, then I have a right to say what I and a large number of people who inhabit that place want. So there is a conflict. Now what has happened is now that we do have bang up front protests, but those are put aside by a corrupt government telling us that we are anti-national, we are against the law, we are terrorists, we are extremists, and we are behind bars. So what do? So corruption takes many forms for the poor. So therefore we now understand that you have to talk about participation in processes of decision making, and that should be whether it's economic decisions, political decisions, or any other decisions, we should have a say. Would you think that rich people in India would agree to their properties being confiscated because there's oil under their homes, or that there is some mineral which has to be mined? They won't let it happen. But every time these mining policies affects very poor people. So there are more fundamental questions than that. So really, these questions have now in India, I do come from a rural community of people, but I now also sit in New Delhi. I'm also a member of a council which advises the government on social policy. And I'm also all over the country looking at corruption which goes beyond just fiscal corruption into corruption because of governance, because of inequality, and because of lack of delivery of justice. And all for the very poor. But it is not only necessarily what we see as, oh, they don't get their food, or they don't get water, or they don't get good health, but there are more fundamental policy decisions which affect their lives, in which they will forever not get access to them. So I think the impact of corruption for the rich, is only in the speed money that they have to give, or that they don't get a scholarship, or they don't get something or the other. But for the poor, it's their right to live. A slogan that was coined during the RTI campaign was the right to know, the right to live. So it's small maybe in monetary terms for each individual person that corruption may just affect in your currency maybe a couple of $1,000s. But if you multiply the impact it has on very poor people, it's enormous. And it means life and death. It means endemic hunger. It means all this. So fighting corruption is really a political battle for us. It's a political battle for inequality of power being replaced by equality of power. What RTI, Right to Information, the campaign is established in India is that we are asking not for sharing of just mere land, not mere money, not having more self-help groups, but we are asking for a share of power which a democratic government guarantees me. So that, I think, is the big realization that's come through RTI, and that's why today in India the discourse has shifted from saying corrupt people must be removed to how do you govern me, I have a right to know, and you are accountable to me. And that is the major shift in the discourse.
Larry, is India mirroring, or Afghanistan mirroring India in any way?
Oddly enough, perhaps Pakistan more, because they both are countries that have a developed rule of law and an expectation among the population that when it's found, it will be rooted out and it will be prevented by the state to whom they've given their trust. There isn't that trust relationship yet in Afghanistan between the state and the population. But can I just first say, Aruna, you can have my seat at any conference, anywhere, anytime. I mean, your remarks are actually the most eloquent pinning down of the consequences of corruption I think I've heard in a long time. And I didn't mean for that to sound at all patronizing. It's really valuable to have someone who talks about the consequences of the true victims of corruption. My exposure and USAID's exposure is typically much more on the large end, the grand corruption. And it has different consequences that are equally, I think, pernicious, maybe just longer in time. And it's along the lines of state capture. It's along the lines of creating habits of corruption. One of the notes that I made was that corruption begets corruption. We don't find our large implementing partners interested in small-scale anything. They don't bid on small awards, and if there is corruption in large development projects, it's usually large-scale corruption. And that makes it, again, more profitable and more difficult for state ministers, be they individuals or even ministries collectively, to resist the allure. And it makes it more attractive for the affluent to engage in practices that are not conducive to an effective state. Let me just one other point on the continuum, because I think we've let ourselves off the hook a little bit. There was an article in Thursday's New York Times, Andrew Rosenthal's Oil Opposition, talked about Citizens United and the opportunities that that may create in the United States for practices that we would not normally consider to be acceptable practices. Making it very clear, this is not me as a U.S. government official saying this is a New York Times op-ed. But throughout the continuum of states, whether they're very highly organized and very highly resistant to state capture, all the way through to Afghanistan's, the attacks never go away. It's how you manage them, how you train your population to insist on transparency, to insist on prosecutions. To me, I think that's one of the pivotal differences. Jose was successful in prosecuting in Pakistan. Certainly it's successfully been prosecuted in the United States. Pakistan, less so. In Afghanistan, they're still at the baby steps of being able to prosecute corruption. I think it's important that we give them examples and opportunities to pursue, and that we help them, that we protect their institutions until they are strong enough to provide the return on trust and return on investment that the electorate demands.
We're going to talk about overcoming, thank you, we're going to talk about overcoming corruption in a second, but I do want to give Jose and Obi a chance to talk about corruption on regular, everyday people that you see. And I realize the time, we have a packed house, folks are sitting on the floor, and if I don't take questions, they're going to say, I'm corrupt. So, we're going, well, yeah, but if I don't take questions, trust me, it's going to be right. So let's talk about just everyday people that you and Jose and Obi can deal with.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Jose.
Okay, first of all, I would like to say that for us that come from colonial countries, it is clear that there's also a historical reason why corruption is a systemic problem. And we that in Peru come from a Spanish pattern of colonialism, making a little bit of research, we found that the position of Viceroy, the Spanish that ruled our countries, was bought in Spain. It was not given to the best public officials, but to the guys that could pay. And if they bought this position, it was not because of philanthropic reasons, but because they wanted to do business. So when they came to our countries, what they did was sell everything they could. So they exploited private contracts and used key positions, gave and sold at the same time key positions to local Creoles. And this was until 1812. So there's a model of construction of society that has been transmitted from year to year until an actual situation where we see that public officials, and there's not a public career in most of our countries, because we are not used to have a public service system that works on the interest of all, but it is a matter of transaction. So I think that the historical reason is also a reason that explains part of the problems we have right now. On the day-to-day impact of corruption, what we see in countries where there's extended administrative corruption, you will see corruption everywhere. I just, during the lunch, told about an experience of the policeman. In most of our countries, policemen are highly corrupted, and this is because several reasons, but it has an impact on the day-to-day life of citizens. When a citizen goes to a ministry or to any public office and tries to obtain a document, they of course will be charged with a bribe, and this is people that have no way to pay additional costs. It is clear that corruption affects poor mostly in their daily lives, and benefits, of course, people that take advantage of this that are not in the lower levels of our societies. So when mobilization between social classes should be based on merits and possibilities of realizing or concreting different options, professional options or labor options in societies that have systemic corruption, the mobilization is based on undue payments, illegal treats, and arrangements that go beyond the law. So when you don't have a rule of law, then it's kind of a jungle. Everybody is trying to obtain a personal gain, and this makes it very difficult for people that has no economical resources to go through. Because people that can pay, of course, will not only pay, but will promote more corrupt practices because they obtain a benefit from that. But it is clear that corruption has a day-to-day impact on the poorest people of our countries.
You know, I think that what's important is for us to keep an eye on the wider dimensions of that I spoke of as being the failure of governance that then leads to the challenges of corruption. And so when you look at, say, public expenditure, which is an important act of governance, how does it function efficiently and effectively to ensure that the delivery of services happen in the way to enable the poor lift themselves out of poverty? To the extent, for example, that investment in health and education don't deliver the right services to the poor, means all over the country, you know, you know basically that it's going to be harder for the poor to lift themselves out of poverty. That's something we come face to face with. There are some of our studies that have shown that in some countries in East Africa and some countries in West Africa, it reaches to the levels of 80% of non-wage investment in sectors like health and education, not resulting in the delivery of services to the poor. Now that's a cost. That's an incredible cost. And how can government be credible and legitimate if it cannot deliver the services that the poor need in order to grow out of poverty? That's one. The second thing is you look at societies that are natural resources rich. So, you know, huge endowment in natural resources. The natural resources become the basis of the elite capture. And they create a rentier state where every other source of growth is not important. It becomes that very mono product of either copper or gold or oil in the case of my country, Nigeria, that every of the elite contest to feast upon. And to the extent that they dedicate all of their time, they commit all of their time to this, what basically happens is that the policies, the economic policies necessary to enable the jump-starting of a diversified economy doesn't happen. Because everything is obviated in order to enable the focus on this activity of natural resources. And what does that do? It collapses the basic infrastructure of the state. And then the third bit of it is, why should citizens feel so disempowered? Because what basically between Larry, Aruna, and Jose, what seems to be resonant in everything that we've been saying is that there's a role for citizens. But why is that role of citizens in the demand for accountability not something that's prevalent? I would say that in the past, a lot of it had to do with the very weak democratic institutions that did not enable the citizens to actually know, the right to know, simply to know. I mean, many citizens, frankly, still don't know anything about the budget of their countries. So what is it you know about the budget? What is it that you define as your expectations from the public spending? are there results that governance should deliver? And how do you demand for it? And so this whole thing about freedom of information, how we ensure that information about governance and what it ought to deliver is well understood by citizens, in order that citizens acting as collective, it's almost like I call it a collective action success, syndrome, can do the work of bonding together, understanding what they must demand, and using that power. I really believe in the power of the citizens. I think that that is what we miss. If we build all the institutions, a lot of people put a lot of investment into building the systems, the structures, the institutions, the organizations, but they will not do everything because you don't have the counterbalancing or the countervailing power of the citizens to demand a certain kind of result from all the systems and structures you built. And I want to finally say that for Jose, it would be good to study the Peruvian experience and figure out whether what we've always felt, that even if you put all the preventive systems and structures and all the institutions that ought to prevent the occurrence of corruption, if you do not have a sanctions regime, an effective sanctions regime for corruption, then you would not have done a comprehensive strategy. It would be interesting to find out whether that successful prosecution that captured quite a lot of people, actually put them away in jail, did it create a deterrence factor within the Peruvian civil service in their tendency to take advantage of the opportunities for corruption?
Jose, would you agree with Obi that overcoming corruption starts with the citizens? It starts from the bottom up, if you will?
I would say that we have two areas that she has very clearly expressed right now. The preventive measures and then the prosecution and all the legal remedies you can apply in order to combat corruption. On the preventive side, I would say that there are several things we can do, but the first one is understand. We need a diagnosis, a real diagnosis of what's going on. I'm a lawyer, and of course I practice legal remedies, but as I was saying during the lunch, I don't think that the legal remedies are the ones that are going to solve the problem. I think that the real measures to be adopted have to be done in the preventive side. And on the preventive side, you of course need to understand first the phenomenon and then interrupt the corrupt routines. There are corrupt routines that are daily working on our systems. And then you have to adopt several means. For example, access to information is one of the key means to be adopted. But it's not only to have the information, because people can have the information of the budgets, of how the expenditures or investments are done. But we also need to understand, and understand these figures, and economical language is not always easy. So we need to educate people in order to understand the information they are receiving. Administrative simplification is one of the most efficient measures that have been adopted in most of the countries. I mean, when you have over-regulated proceedings, then you have more chances for public officers in order to obtain illicit gains from step to step. If we simplify the measures in order to obtain services from the state and the local governments, of course the possibilities of reducing corruption are much more. And then we need to break impunity. Corruption and impunity are the two faces of the same phenomenon. If people see that nothing happens, that the leaders of the country, the high-profile officers, are stealing money and nothing happens to them, of course there's a spiral phenomenon that will go on the descendant escalator until the lower levels of society. So we need, Klitgar said, we need to fry some big fish. We need to fry some big fish. People need to see and experience that if someone bribes or steals, is going to receive a punishment. And I would say this is one of the lessons that we could put forward in the Peruvian case. Now the question is, was this useful? Peruvian people had a lesson to learn. Now public officers are deterred because what happened, I would say that it's a pity, but there's a negative response because anti-corruption efforts need to be consistent and permanent. There's a phenomenon that now is being studied by researchers and academics in corruption issues that is called that re-corruption. After some strong efforts in order to back corruption, they come back. And re-corruption is worse than corruption because they learn the lessons and they know how to come now with different strategies. So we need to understand all these phenomena in order to be successful addressing this issue. Now, on the prosecution side, there are also several measures that can be adopted. And I would say that these are lessons that we understood from the Peruvian case. We need independent investigators. I mean, investigators cannot be appointed by those who are going to be investigated. And usually that's what happens. The attorney generals and the judges are all in the payroll of the corrupt and the crooks. So who are they going to investigate? That's a major issue. We need to create systems and proceedings in order to appoint the best people away from the political manipulation of the potential investigated people. We need teams that understand these corrupt routines, that have enough motivation in order to be strong against corruption. And of course, teams that have financial skills and others that need to be put in place in order to address this multi-task phenomenon.
Can I jump in? There's something he said. You know, it almost, when you're faced with a problem that becomes so systemic, like you said, where the one who's supposed to catch the thief is the thief himself, you're faced with a dilemma. But what it seems to me is we need to look at it as where do we have our entry points, and then carve away at those entry points until we can actually find some islands of integrity, as we often refer to it in Transparency International. It seems to me that one important thing is if we kept in perspective that this is a wider governance failure that is creating the impetus for corruption, then we need to sort of say to ourselves, it must be that the cost of bad behavior is low and the profit is high, right? So if the cost is low and the profit is high, how is it that we can build the mechanisms that will reverse this so that the cost is high and the profit is very low? And, you know, so it goes from, you know, the kind of citizens' engagement and in the democratic process. How do we ensure that the democratic process makes it costly for public officials who currently have no disincentive? All right? They have no disincentive from being corrupt. There's nothing that prevents them from being corrupt. In fact, if they are corrupt, then they are guaranteed that they would have their next elections and many elections thereafter. But how is it that the citizens can engage from the very beginning of the democratic process in a way that would lead to a different set of outcome? Because what Jose said about finding the right people, what's the incentive of a corrupt president for finding the right people? He wants the wrong people. That's the way that he can, he can carry on with his bad behavior. So he has no incentive. But the citizens' engagement in the process of determining the quality and the character of the people becomes an important entry point. And then at the level of the sectoral allocation of public resources in order to determine good outcomes for citizens, how many people normally care about the health issues and yet follow nothing about the health policies and those who determine some of the things that happen in health? And then they just talk in general terms that health is not giving us the right outcomes. Well, they don't care to give you the right outcomes. That's exactly why they're behaving the way they are. So empirically understanding the issues on the part of citizens, I am huge on the demand side issues for accountability. More citizens must demand for accountability. and demand in a systemic and sustained way. Episodic demand for accountability, where it's the fad to just talk about it and then you move on to other things. It will not create the change of lower cost or lower profit, higher cost for bad behavior. Thank you.
Aruna, you are part of that accountability, transparency, if you will, in India. Can you talk, add on to this discussion about overcoming corruption? And if I may, if folks have questions, you can start lining up at the microphones, and we'll start taking your questions after Aruna comes.
I'm very thankful to Obi because she stated my entire case. But in any case, I'll add a little bit to what she said. The point is, when we have gone to audit socially, publicly, government works, people have been very scared. When the government auditor comes, there's no fear. So I remember once in a small district called Baswara in Rajasthan, when we had a big sit-in strike and there was a big furor about accessing information and asking for accountability, that the auditor of that area and a couple of policemen came to me and said, but why are these people so scared of you? People come and go, but they're not scared. I said, well, you see, I have no arms. I have nothing. I'm with the poor people. We have not even money. We can't even bribe anybody. So you tell me, why are they scared of us? Then they said, you speak the truth. That's why they're scared of you. And you're unbribable. That's why they're scared of you. So if that is so, then it's really important that we evolve systems that will respond to that kind of truth being spoken. And it's in that effort to find a system that India has really used its right to information to evolve some good systems. And I'll share a few quickly, practical ones before I finish. Because if you see, the one after this please, this is a board which is up on every village council, on the walls of government buildings. This tells you all the information about an extremely big works program in India, the highest spending works program in the world, where in every village there are hundreds of people who work and millions and billions of dollars have been spent all over the country. If you take it and if there are huge scams in it, it will be the hugest in India. So what do you do with it? You can't have one policing agency in one city looking at it. You have to have people monitor. So you see that. Can I have the next slide, please? So you have this with names of people, with amount of days they have worked, amount of money that's been given to them, and the year in which this expenditure has been taken. This is there in over 900,000 villages in Rajasthan and in many thousands of villages in India. You have to make it practical and you have to make it local. Otherwise, corruption cannot be contained, cannot be resolved, cannot be fought. In a country, in any country, but especially in mine, where there's decentralization and there's spending at the grassroots, there's no other way you can. So we've transferred what you will look at in a computer, which is the MIS, to what we call the JIS, the Janta Information System. Janta in my language means people. So it's with that kind of thing that it will be solved. I have one thing to say about technology, though it hasn't been mentioned here. There was a paper circulated to me which spoke about technology. Can I have the next slide, please? This is a photograph of me and my friend Norati. She's a Dalit woman, that means she's an untouchable. She hasn't gone to school, and the two of us oppose the kind of technology that's imposed on us, where we are offered technical solutions for political problems and we refute that it cannot be done. But yet, Norati has learned the computer. She teaches basic computer to girls who have studied much more than she has. She is the village chief. She has won an election on the promise of integrity. She combines many things. And she is at the bottom of the pile. She still is a very poor woman. She hasn't taken a penny home. And you have me on the other side. And I use computers, and I am also called the techie granny, because I am called granny by all my people in the village. But the point is, technology is not reduced to what I can use or not use. And I've quoted Lewis Carroll in that, and that's the most important thing. If you have read Lewis Carroll, I don't know if people read him anymore, but if you read Alice in Wonderland, and there Humpty Dumpty and Alice have a marvelous conversation about words. And Humpty Dumpty says, the question is, says Humpty Dumpty, Who is the master, that's all. Because he makes words mean anything, and Alice is very, very confused about the way he uses words. So technology is needed, but who is the master? Who's going to decide what kind of technology we want? And if you look at women's technology, if you look at poor people's technology, we've got nothing. You get technology to exploit, but you don't get technology to make life better. So it's that issue, and not really a fight against technology. I just wanted to add this because it is something that has been part of the paper circulated, and I've circulated a small piece of paper in which I've said everything. There's no time, but I must end with one quotation, which has become a kind of mantra for me. And it's not an Indian I quote a South African. I quote Jeremy Cronin, and whom I've read but I've never met. I hope one day to meet him. And he says about democracy and about many things associated with democracy. He says that, what is democracy? Democracy is speaking truth to power. Speaking truth to power, making truth powerful and power truthful. And that's a very huge bite for any one of us. It's a big struggle because truth is the opposite of corruption. And if you want to bring truth out, it's going to be a very hard battle. And it's going to be fought both politically and economically today, because money which comes in investment does not answer in India. My government will answer, but foreign investment doesn't answer. So we have to look at global financial capital, we have to look at governance, and we have to look at all these matters. It's only then that we'll get a decent living. So I end there because I don't have time to go into anything, but I do think it's been a marvelous debate. Thank you.
Well, let's take some questions now. Let's see how we're going to handle this. First of all, please remember that a question is a sentence that ends with a question mark. So please, no statements. Please try to keep your questions to about 140 characters. But more importantly, let's try and do this, because we have a lot of questions. I want to try and get as many in as possible. What I would like to do, if you could ask a question, state your name, of course, direct it to whomever you want to direct it to, if it's to everyone, so you can direct it to. Let's try and take 3 questions at a time, and then we'll answer them, okay? So your question first, please.
Hi. My name is Mohammed Al-Bardan. I'm from Syria. My question is directed to anybody. In the case of the country that have revolutions right now, like the Arab Spring countries, when these countries will get totally their freedom, how should they deal with the corruption? Should they be tough and strict, or should they be tolerant, where the corruption mentality is existing in every single person there? Thank you.
Very good. Next one.
Thank you. My name is Faith. I'm from Syracuse University. I'm thinking about, my question's for everybody anyway. Thinking about solutions to corruption, I'm wondering if the top-down approach of naming and shaming is really effective, serving as a deterrent for intending public officials, and if it's effective, how can developing countries, help to change this problem of having strong men instead of strong institutions who take charge of political institutions?
Very good, thank you. And
my name is Naman. I am from Carnegie Mellon University. My question is to Arunaji. The question is, can you talk a bit about the aspirational level of corruption, aspirational side of corruption? Like, it's not necessarily that there's poor versus one who has a lot of power. Even on the other side, it's sometimes like behind every corrupted person is a poor family or a hungry family is often said. So if you could talk a bit about it.
very good, thank you. Arab Spring countries and corruption. Who wants to take that?
Go ahead.
I was going to say 3 things: governance, education, expectations, and transparency. That's 4 things. So you have to have effective governance, so the population will believe in the government. You have to educate the population what their rights and responsibilities are and what they can expect from that government. Their expectations have to be high. And then I think the transparency, the mechanisms that TI has generated are some great ones. But there has to be transparency so that they can see what's being done.
Anyone else want to say?
I think the only thing I would add to that is you've got to involve your citizens in the conversation as to what kind of society you want to create. In many of the societies, there's not been that dialogue as to what the society's attitude toward corruption would be. And everyone agreeing about the kind of comprehensive package of solutions that would be used to tackle corruption. So often, what he alluded to as top-down, really acts in the opposite direction, which is that people sort of have bureaucrats who sit together and design an anti-corruption strategy. And then the institutions are trying to implement them, but they are alienated from the citizens. And therefore the citizens don't engage and participate in the process. So the Arab Spring countries do have an opportunity for the kind of dialogue that would lead to a good identification of the menu of options that they have in tackling corruption. Can I, yeah, go ahead.
I'm really glad that the women on the panel tend to agree so much. I'm really glad. Well, anyway, I do think people have to sit together. But what's happened as a retrospect, if you look at what's happened in Egypt, in India, I met 20 Egyptians who came to a seminar on governance and on democracy. And their predicament was that while they all wanted to remove a government, previous government, they did not know what they wanted instead. So what Obi is saying really is that you need to have a framework in which you want the new government to perform. You have to have both an ideological statement, principles that you define clearly, and then the kind of non-negotiables that you will not tolerate in a new government. Corruption will be one of them. There will be many other things. Maybe inequalities, maybe differences, maybe discrimination of gender. There may be many things that are very important to you. So those non-negotiables will have to be mentioned. It's only then that a new system will evolve, which will replace the older one. Because there was a lot of debate, and I found it most fascinating when I met those people near Mumbai about 3 months ago. And I spent lots of time discussing with them what their possibilities were. And this is what I understood from that discussion. There must be much that I don't understand. I met a Syrian as well there, by the way.
Well, let's stay with you with the spiritual question, spiritual corruption.
It's not spiritual corruption he was talking about. He was talking about poverty-related corruption. He was saying that when you're so poor, it's like Les Miserables, another book no one reads anymore, about Victor Hugo, where a man goes to jail for stealing a loaf of bread and he stays there for life. So, is it a worse crime to steal a loaf of bread than to kill somebody? The man who kills gets free, and the man who steals a loaf of bread is in jail. I think that's the kind of question he asked. And I think nothing justifies corruption. Ethically, no. So therefore, the burden is on people who are around that poor man or woman or family not to let them starve, and the poor do not steal. And I just want to take 1 minute to tell you a story. It's a very moving story, because I remember in 1987 we had drought in Rajasthan. I live in a village hut and people around me were not eating, and we had very little. We have a very, very spare diet. We just have bread and lentils, that's all. And when the kids used to come, I used to say to them, why don't you eat? They would always say, we've had a meal. The poor do not, generally, there's no money. Where will they pay a bribe? So it's not the poor who bribe. It's the middle level that bribes, always. Please remember that. The poor just go from pillar to post, but they don't bribe. So actually this argument is really for the middle level and not for the poor, as far as I know.
Yeah, the transition from persons to institution is always a huge challenge, and I would say it's a challenge because it depends in a good extent to political will, and political will changes very easily because leaders change and because governments change every 4, 5, 3 years depending of the systems. But then where there's no political will, I think civil society has a huge role to play. I mean, we have to demand and generate this political will and also ethical leadership. I mean, we don't have ethical leader from the top and people observing that there's an intention of our leaders in order to work in an integrity mood, things will not be better. So it is true what you said, that most of the efforts we've seen in our countries is because some individual had a special motivation or some particularity and he could do it. The challenge is how we institutionalize that, and I think there are several measures to be adopted there.
My name is Mom Neo. I am from indigenous people of Chitong Hill Tracts, Bangladesh. What we have seen in our community, where less than 1% of the population, and corruption used against us, against the small minority to exploit them and create more injustice. So some of you mentioned about citizen engagement, but if you are a small minority, in our case, when government builds a dam, less than 2% receive monetary compensation. Rest of it went to bribery and some other cases. So in those kind of cases, when you're a small minority, how you work on community engagement and build a nationwide group to work against a government that is still in power. So in case of Peru, when you're a small minority, how would you raise against Fujimori when he's still in power? Thank you.
Real quick.
My name is Catherine Craig. I'm from Harvard. And when I hear the word corruption, I think money. And I think, when I hear money, I think aid in response to developing countries. And what I would like to ask the panel is there a responsibility of organizations like the World Bank and USAID to see that even, for example, that the mission of USAID is to advance American interests? Why is it in developing countries that the money that USAID often comes between the leader and the people and what the people's needs are? So essentially it's a wedge, and I'm referring to Sub-Saharan Africa, and I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Quickly.
In the recent article in the New York Times about the ongoing corruption scandal in China, I was struck by the mention of money hidden abroad, of children being sent to elite institutions abroad, beginning with the letter H, and dual citizenship being bought. So I wonder, what is the implications? What are the implications for that developed that countries that are perceived as less corrupt? How are they complicit? How are they implicated in kind of global corruption? Thank you.
Citizen engagement. Quickly, please.
You refer to the minority group. You know, without downplaying the fact that a minority group sounds like minority and weak, I'd like to say that it's much more, the opportunity for minority to be strong is higher today than it used to be in the past. The fact that you're here at the Kennedy School, I assume you are. Are you a student here?
I'm in the Graduate School of Education.
You're in,
We built a school in the Hill Tracts.
But you're in Harvard.
Yes.
You've got an incredible network of global citizens that you're meeting. That's made your group to no longer be minority because they have you. And a big network of people that can give voice. They can amplify your voice against a strong state. I mean, today's social media really helps the minority group. And I think that it's the sustained and systemic use of information and the dissemination of that information to your own citizens. Because what could come between what you call the minority agitation and result could be if they looked at you as an elite. If they could sort of isolate you and say you really don't represent the minority, that means you're not even understanding their issue, neither are they understanding what you are about. But I would say that you have an opportunity there to really use your network well. I thought I should quickly say that on the aid question, that on the aid question, you know, there was a time when development aid really had a lot to answer for in terms of whether it was effective or whether it was delivering results. But I think that whether it's the bilateral partners like USAID or DFID in the case of UK, or multilateral partners like ourselves, the World Bank and the Africa Development Bank, everyone got the message. Aid must work. It must deliver results. And so there has been an improvement in terms of the systems of execution and monitoring. And he used to be in the integrity unit of the World Bank. Now, in our programs, we build in all the mechanisms to prevent corruption, but we don't fool ourselves that corruption will not happen. Therefore, when they happen, the action that we must take must ensure that on a sustained basis, we become predictable as being an institution that will punish corruption when it happens. And that's the way we've been trying to tackle this hydra-headed monster.
Yeah, regarding minorities, I totally agree with Obi in the sense that you need to identify your allies. I mean, we were successful in our case because we were able to identify our local allies, our international allies. Investigative press is always a very useful partner in these kind of adventures. And then for the prosecution case we had, but you can apply this for different situations, we had the cooperation of different countries, international NGOs, multilateral banks that now have resources and can send us resource persons in order to advocate in favor of a case. So if you can identify your allies and build networks, and now social media is a great means, then probably you will find a way out for a difficult situation like the one you mentioned.
You don't talk in bullet points, but that's okay. So I'm going to have you close this up. But you had a final thought.
Well, I have a couple of things to say. One is about the Chittagong travels, because I'm close to you. I think your coming to Harvard will not solve it. I don't think the Western press writing about you is going to solve it. You'll have to seek your solutions in mobilizing support within Bangladesh, holding hands with other people struggling for rights, whether they are women or whether they are others, and seeking support in South Asia. I don't think the US doesn't even know what's happening in India, but every Bangladeshi knows what's happening in India. Like I know what's happening in Bangladesh. So I think these are solutions that will come only from the regions. And I think there is an organization called South Asian for Human Rights, SAHR, which works for all these issues. And I think Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka are all together in it. The people there, not governments. And I think those institutions should help you a lot. And I think in answer to that, catching one big thief is important. And I think hanging and shaming and putting behind bars or whatever we do is important. It's necessary but not sufficient. And I think if we think of a single solution for corruption, it's not possible. I think you have to have what's happened in Peru. You have to have what Obi is suggesting, but I believe in, that there must be systemic changes and day-to-day stemming of corruption. It's extremely important. But I'd like to just at the tail end tell you that in Delhi, when we went to the World Bank and asked for information, they told us that their disclosure policy does not permit it. And then, I won't go back. What I have done is the solution. We don't go to the World Bank. We hold our national governments responsible. They take our vote. They serve us. We have a constitution. They take my responsibility through that vote, my sovereignty, to rule me for 5 years. They are responsible. And what they do with the World Bank should be mandated by me. So the World Bank is there, but the World Bank doesn't call the shots. It will be my political party and my government that should call the shots. And I think this is a realization that's come to us through the right to information and the use of right to information, that the Delhi government gave us the information which the World Bank wouldn't. So I think World Bank is important because this does internationally have an impact. But I think national governments have to be brought to heel, and that's the task
of all of us citizens. Thank you.
Would you permit me to say that she's my ideal kind of citizen that I want?
Thank you very much, Obi, Larry, Jose, and Aruna. If you could, there is another panel in here like now. So perhaps if the four of you can go outside and answer other questions outside.